Have you ever stopped to think, what actually makes a country a country? Is it just a line on a map, or maybe a king on a throne? For a long, long time, the answer was pretty simple. But then, in 1789, the French Revolution came along and just completely blew up all those old ideas. And it gave us something totally new, something radical, the idea of the nation.
All right, let's just start with this, wow, this incredible image. It was made in 1848 by an artist named Sorrieu, and it's his dream for the future. You see all the peoples of Europe and America marching in this long procession right past the Statue of Liberty. And notice how they're all grouped together with their own flags and national costumes. Now, look down on the ground. See all those shattered crowns? Those are the symbols of absolute monarchy, all broken. It's this amazing vision of a world made of free nations, all living in brotherhood.
So this vision of Sorrieu's, well, to put it simply, it was utopian. It's this beautiful, perfect dream of a world that, let's be honest, is probably never going to happen, at least not exactly like he pictured it.
Okay, so that's the dream, right? But it makes you wonder, where did this huge, world-changing idea of a nation even begin? Where did it come from? So here's how we're going to break it down. We'll look at how the people first decided that they were in charge. Then we'll get into the nuts and bolts of how you actually build a nation. After that, we'll see how this idea started spreading outside of France. And finally, we'll dig into the very complicated legacy of Napoleon. All right, Section 1. The people become sovereign. This sounds huge, and it is. But before we can get to how the people took over, we really need to get a picture of what they were up against. So let's set the scene in France before the revolution, because what was happening then, man, it set the stage for a massive, massive change. So before 1789, if you asked, what is France? The answer was surprisingly simple. It was basically the king's personal property. Seriously, the land, the resources, the people on it, it all belonged to whoever was wearing the crown. The king didn't just run the state, the king was the state. And there's a word for this system, absolutist. It's pretty much what it sounds like, right? The monarch's power was absolute. There were no checks, no balances, just one ruler calling all the shots. And as you can imagine, that often meant it was a pretty repressive way to govern. And then, boom, the French Revolution comes along and just flips that entire idea upside down. It declared that sovereignty, that ultimate right to rule, was being yanked away from one guy, the king, and handed over to millions of French citizens. From now on, the people would be the nation. The people would shape its destiny. Just think about how radical that was. Okay, so you've declared that the people are the nation. Great. But how do you actually, do that? How do you get millions of people to suddenly feel like they're part of one big team? It's not something that happens overnight. Well, the French revolutionaries, they actually had a plan, a kind of blueprint for building a nation.
This is so cool. Look at this shift in language, because it's about so much more than just words. Before, you were a subject of the king. You basically belonged to him. But after, you became le citoyen, the citizen, and the kingdom became la patrie, the fatherland. This wasn't just a rebrand. It was a total rewiring of what it meant to belong. It meant you had rights, sure, but you also had a duty to this new thing, this community, not just some guy on a throne. And they didn't just talk the talk. They took real concrete steps to make this feeling of nationhood a reality. For starters, new symbols. Out went the old royal flag, in came the new tricolor. The whole system of government changed. The old Estates General got a new name, the National Assembly, and it was elected by the people. They also unified the country in practical ways, creating the same laws for everybody and getting rid of all those pesky internal taxes. And this is a big one. They pushed for one common language, the French spoken in Paris, so everyone could be part of the same conversation. Now, an idea this big and this powerful, it's not going to stay put. It's bound to spread. And the French revolutionaries, well, they felt they had a mission, a duty to export this idea. And they weren't really asking if anyone else wanted it. Yeah, they saw themselves as total liberators. Their grand mission? To march across Europe and help everyone else overthrow their own oppressive kings, what they called despotism, so they could become free nations too. And just look at these two images from Germany at the time. They tell the whole story. On one side, you've got this celebration, the French are planting a tree of liberty, and everyone's happy. But then you look at the other side, and it's the total opposite. The French soldiers are seen as thugs, stealing from people, being awful. It's the perfect illustration of the big question. Were they liberators, or were they just conquerors?
Well, the truth, as always, was complicated. At first, in places like Holland, Switzerland, and Italy, people were thrilled. They saw the French as harbingers of liberty. But that excitement didn't last long. Turns out, liberation came with some strings attached. We're talking higher taxes, censorship, and, oh yeah, being forced to join the French army to fight their wars. Suddenly, that promise of freedom started to feel a little hollow.
And this is where one of the most complicated figures in all of history steps onto the stage: Napoleon Bonaparte. This guy took all those revolutionary ideas and kind of bent them into a shape that worked for him.
This is the huge contradiction with Napoleon, right? On the one hand, he grabs power, literally crowns himself emperor, and basically kills democracy in France. But on the other hand, as he's conquering Europe, the way he runs things, his reforms, actually spreads the ideas of the revolution everywhere he goes. It's wild.
His secret weapon, in a way, was the Napoleonic Code from 1804. This thing was a game changer. It got rid of all the old privileges you got just for being born into the right family. It said everyone was equal in the eyes of the law. It protected private property. And, maybe most importantly, it completely dismantled the old feudal system, freeing peasants from being tied to the land and a local lord. So while he was an emperor, he was also exporting these incredibly modern, revolutionary ideas. So eventually Napoleon is defeated in 1815, and all the old kings and queens of Europe try to put everything back the way it was. You know, put the old families back on their thrones, redraw the old maps. But you just can't do that. The genie was out of the bottle. This idea of the nation, of a people with a shared identity, a shared destiny, it wasn't going anywhere.
So, this brings us full circle, right back to that big question we started with. If a nation isn't just some territory that a monarch owns, then what is it?
Well, years later, a philosopher named Ernst Renan came up with what might be the most powerful answer. He said a nation is all about a shared past, all the struggles and sacrifices, but here's the kicker. He said its existence is a daily plebiscite. Now, a plebiscite is basically a vote where everyone gets a say. So what Renan was saying is that a nation isn't some fixed thing on a map. It's a choice. It's an idea that every single person has to wake up and choose to be a part of every single day.